Hello all. We're talking about John chapter 3 verses 11 through 17 today, and it's pretty obvious that the theme of this section is love one another. What do we learn about loving one another from this particular section? First of all, we learn that loving one another is a message that John's readers had heard from the beginning. From the beginning. I believe that beginning is the ministry of Christ. I think verse 23 of this very chapter points that out, that loving one another is a command of Jesus himself. And so, John is trying to take his readers back to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and he says, here is our standard for how we should live. Now, he's used this phrase many times already in 1 John, from the beginning, from the beginning. I want you to remember what you've heard from the beginning, and I want to take from that our author's standard for true Christianity is what was taught and preached and commanded from the beginning, going back to the ministry and the life of Jesus. This is our standard of authority in all that we do. What did Jesus say? What did Jesus teach? What did Jesus command? That's our standard for what true Christianity is all about. Number two, John contrasts love and hatred. He uses the example of Cain and the example of Jesus Christ and contrasts those two characters. But he tells us that hatred is the characteristic of the world and love is the characteristic of God. We remember that Jesus taught us to love our enemies. Yes, even our enemies. That's somewhere in the Gospel of Luke. Hatred is wholly incompatible with the Spirit of Christ, and it's incompatible with spiritual life. We can't say that we have spiritual life if we harbor hatred in our heart for other people. Number three, we learn from this text that love for one another is proof that we have passed from death to life. Now, it's not the basis for our spiritual life, but it is the evidence that we have passed from the state of spiritual death to the state of spiritual life. And we really ought to linger here and talk about the joy of knowing that we are now living in a state of life, that we have passed from death, but we're not going to linger there. Number four, John shows us that the distinctively Christian definition of love is what? Jesus' sacrificial death. That's verse 16. He was willing to lay down his life for us. And I wonder if any of John's readers remember something that he wrote in John chapter 10, the Gospel of John chapter 10, that the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus laid down his life for us, and that, of course, is the supreme definition and description of what love is all about. And finally, number five, this section tells us that the specific application of the command to love one another is our willingness to lay down our lives for one another. What are we willing to do for one another in order to accomplish one another's good? John says we need to be willing to even die for one another. Now, we rarely will have that opportunity, although when that opportunity presents itself, we would be willing, wouldn't we, to lay down our lives for one another. But more often, we're going to have the opportunity to share what we have with those who are in need. And John tells us in the last verse of this section that we cannot say that we love one another if we're not willing to share what we have with our brothers and sisters in need. So, we must be prepared to meet the needs of our brothers and sisters, whatever the cost. If we're not willing to share what we have, nope, we're lacking in Christian love. And from this section, we know what that means, if we're lacking in Christian love. Here's a very brief preview of 1 John chapter 3, verses 18 through 24. In this section, John's going to talk about the basis of our confidence, Christian confidence. How can we know, upon what basis can we know that we are right with God? It'll be an interesting study, won't it? So glad you're with me in this journey through 1 John. I'll see you in just a few days. God bless.